Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We are continuing our discussion of the English colonies. In the previous lecture, we talked about the New England colonies and the Puritans. And in this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion extending to the Middle Colonies. So, previously we focused on New England, and in this lecture, we're going to be talking more about the Middle Colonies, focusing on New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, before we get to the Middle Colonies, I do want to mention some of the other New England colonies outside of the Boston, Plymouth, Massachusetts area, because gradually the New England colonies did spread from that beginning point. It was not uncommon for groups unhappy with the restrictions of Puritanism to leave and form settlements of their own. This was the case in 1635, when a minister named Thomas Hooker led his congregation west and established the town of Hartford. This town soon served as the center of the new colony of Connecticut, and you can see that location here. Another dissenter was Roger Williams, a young minister from Salem, Massachusetts. In 1635, Williams led a group of dissenters and established the town of Providence, which eventually became the capital of Rhode Island, the only colony in which all faiths could worship without interference. You see the location of Providence, Rhode Island there. Another such dissenter was Anne Hutchinson, a Boston woman who argued that many Puritan clergymen were not members of the elect. She also argued against the limited role of women in Puritan society. In 1638, she was banished from Massachusetts and moved to Rhode Island. Other dissenters moved to the thinly populated northern colonies of New Hampshire and Maine. With that, let's move to a discussion now of the Middle Colonies. And again, just as a reminder and to get your bearings geographically, we're talking about New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The key characteristic of this region is diversity. It is a sort of middle ground between the Chesapeake and New England, as we've discussed already. And it also included a wide diversity of ethnic groups, religions, cultures, economies, and immigrant groups from the old world of Europe. In fact, it was not overwhelmingly English and wasn't originally settled by the English. Instead, it was the Dutch who initiated the first settlement in this area, and other groups like the Germans, Scots, Swedes, Finns, and others arrived in this area even before the English. And we're going to be talking about some of those groups and some of that diversity more in detail in just a few minutes. But to just give you some general characteristics for now, this diversity contributed to a factional political life and the development of what we might describe as modern political tools or methods. Because no one group held a clear-cut majority, candidates for leadership took to campaigning and hustling for votes. There's a vibrant, sort of growing newspaper community. And ultimately, the two-party system evolves out of this diversity. So this is in contrast to certainly the Puritans, where you had one group that was very much in control and maintained kind of rigid level of control. In the Middle Colonies, no one group has that kind of power. And so you have to sort of campaign and convince people of your arguments. There's also a much greater level of toleration in this region for the same reasons. There's a great variety of religious and ethnic groups, so no one group controls enough of the power to really harshly repress the other groups. The economy is also diverse, and this is contributed as well to a diverse kind of geographic reality and landscape. So in some areas of upstate New York, you have a plantation-style agricultural economy that strongly resembles what we've discussed in the Chesapeake. In other areas, you have a vibrant coastal economy, more replicating what we talked about in New England. You have small towns and an array of different industries and different methods. And so, again, diversity, really the key quality as we discuss these middle colonies. For the most part, the middle colonies evolve out of a phenomenon known as restoration colonies. In the 1660s, Charles II returned to the throne in England after a long civil war. As a sort of payment for those who were loyal to him and his allies while he was away from the throne, he bestowed huge land grants to many of those allies as a reward for their loyalty and support. This was known as the Restoration, and these colonies come to be called the Restoration Colonies. They include the Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. These lands are essentially private land grants, and they are controlled by whoever was given the land grant who could make the rules of their own. So, for instance, in 1664, Charles II granted land to his brother, the Duke of York. After a brief squabble with the Dutch surrendered the territory of New Amsterdam, which we know today as New York. So this territory was already settled by a large and diverse population, including the Dutch, Germans, French, Scandinavians, Indians, and Africans, among others. In addition, the Duke of York offered land grants to his own friends and allies, and the countryside around the city of New York became filled with plantation holders and other friends of the Duke of York. New Jersey evolved into its own separate colony, the result of two of the large land grants, and it also had a very diverse population. Pennsylvania was the result of another restoration grant to William Penn, you see pictured here, in 1681. Penn was a convert to the Quaker religion, which would make this a unique colony. The Quakers rejected predestination and original sin. They believed in individual worship and disregarded, for the most part, class and gender differences. They were pacifists who did not engage in war with the Indians, and rather they maintained friendly relations with the Indians and would purchase lands from them and trade with them, and so on. As such, Pennsylvania was a peaceful and prosperous colony. Penn's capital city of Philadelphia quickly became one of the leading cities in all of the colonies, which we will discuss in future lectures. So let's talk just a bit about the diversity in these middle colonies, some of the different groups who were there. Again, there are too many to go into great detail, but I'll mention a few of the most significant. Starting with the Germans, who migrated mostly to Pennsylvania and established in 1683 a town called Germantown in Pennsylvania, established by a group of Quaker families. So why did some Germans migrate? Well, the major push factors tended to be economics, economic hardship back in Germany, or perhaps political factors. In 1708 and 09, there was a very harsh winter back in Germany, which led to some poverty and disagreements. So religion was not the primary push factor for these groups. So these are not like the Puritans or Pilgrims or some of the others. So Germans arriving for those various regions tended to arrive in New York or New England and then migrated, many of them, out into the countryside. Between 1627 and 1740, there were an average of more than 1,800 Germans arriving each year during this period. So they became a relatively large and prosperous group in the Americas. The majority of Germans traveled as families and became farmers, and others came originally as indentured servants, which is a process we're going to be talking about in great detail in the next chapter. But it essentially meant that they were too poor to afford their own passage, and so in exchange for someone else paying for their passage, they agreed to work for them. As one German explained at that time, they preferred being slaves in America to being free townsmen in Germany. Other groups settling in this region included the Scotch Irish. These were typically Presbyterians from the Scottish lowlands, many of whom settled in Northern Ireland, and so they found themselves as Protestants in a Catholic land. And so there was some persecution religiously. Also, the poor economy was a factor for them, and they were charged high rent by English landlords. And so there was much that was attractive about coming to America for these Scots Irish. Once in America, they tended to shun New England and migrate to the Middle Colonies, and many of them sort of trickled south from Pennsylvania as far as the highlands and mountains of the Carolinas. This group formed much of the population of the Carolina backcountry, kind of rough and tumble communities, and they might be described as frontiersmen, very tough, rugged individuals. Their reputation also suffered because they tended to produce whiskey. Um, while there was certainly drinking involved, there also was simple economics in why they made so much whiskey. They tended to live far inland, far away from cities, sometimes over mountains. It was very difficult to transport huge quantities of grain, so rather they would process that grain into whiskey, which made for much easier transportation. Other groups migrating in this period included the Irish, and they were in this era relatively small in number, but eventually, of course, will become one of the largest immigrant groups coming. They were Catholics in a Protestant land back in England and Ireland. There were harsh penalties put upon them. It was difficult for them to acquire land. They had no place in government. Some of them were imprisoned. And so they had every reason to escape from their homeland if they could. Many of them went to mainland Europe, smaller numbers coming to America, but eventually we will talk about larger numbers down the road. And then there were also Jews arriving in the Middle Colonies in this period. The first arriving in 1654, coming from Brazil. There were always very small numbers of Jews compared to these other groups. By 1790, there were only about 2,000 of them in all of these colonies. And yet they were an important minority. They tended to live in port cities and worked in commerce, so a number of them rose to positions of wealth and prominence. And yet they were very much a minority. There was certainly some persecution against them in this era, and so it was not always easy times for them. Marriages, for instance, were difficult. There were so few Jews that they had to arrive at some interesting arrangements. Mixed faith marriages were not uncommon, depending on the sort of regulations in each area. And in some cases, you saw long distance relationships or long distance marriages because there were no other Jews nearby. So, we see in the Middle Colonies this rich diversity. Now, I would note that still, for the most part, this population is predominantly English in nature. And as we move through the next few lessons and we talk about the growth of the colonies and eventually the onset of revolution, we'll still see that these colonies viewed themselves as English and that English sensibility still dominated. But in the Middle Colonies anyway, great diversity is the key characteristic.